Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking time to support the Cincinnati Civil War Roundtable experience, which is still one of the most important events in our history, and its long shadow is still influencing our lives today. Today, we're going to discuss Ulysses S. Grant's rise as a general. Our story officially begins in August of 1861 when Grant is promoted to brigadier general thanks to the support of Illinois Congressman Elihu Washburn, a good friend of President Lincoln's and a good friend of Grant's, who met him when he lived in Galena, Illinois prior to the war. The two would develop a lifelong friendship, and it would be positive for them both in times of crisis and victory throughout the war and Grant's presidency. Grant's philosophy on war really defines in a single statement how he felt even prior to his promotion. He said, quote, "The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on." And that's exactly how he approached almost every battle. He was offensive minded and believed that the aggressor would eventually win, and he was generally right despite the cost in several of his engagements. For any detractors, there is one simple fact that really summarizes Grant's amazing record. He is the only general on either side to have three separate armies surrender to him. The first at Fort Donelson in February of '62, the second at Vicksburg in July of '63, and of course, Lee at Appomattox in April of 1865. As a general, Grant was quietly confident and learned quickly, and he was anything but a butcher. He actually lost less men as a percentage than Robert E. Lee and most generals on either side that fought for more than 2 years. "Everyone has superstitions," he once wrote. "One of mine always has been when I started to go anywhere or do anything, never to turn back or stop until the thing intended was accomplished." As far as his attire goes, he looked anything but a general. He wore an enlisted man's overcoat, never carried a gun, and rarely his sword. He slouched and only wore his rank on his shoulder straps without any medals, ribbons, or anything else that would speak to his amazing rank or record. This slide, as it relates to our story here tonight, really talks to the importance of Grant. As you review through this, and you can see from 1862 all the way through Sherman's march up towards Raleigh, North Carolina, Grant was involved in almost every one of these engagements in the Western Theater, either personally on the battlefield or one of the commanders, his subordinates underneath him. That's how involved he was in the winning of the West. It did not take long for Grant's offensive strategy to seize the initiative. The Confederates invaded Kentucky in September of 1861 and took possession of Columbus due to its proximity on the Mississippi River in far western Kentucky. In reply, on September 6th, Grant captured Paducah, Kentucky without firing a shot. He seized possession of the rail lines and the telegraph lines, commandeered leather and food meant for the Confederate Army, and distributing those to his men. He told the residents he came not as an invader, but to, quote, "least annoy peaceable citizens who obeyed the law." He heard that a large rebel force was moving towards the city, but he doubted the rumor. He would learn a hard lesson on the importance of recon and intelligence, but he never lost faith in taking the fight to the enemy. This would prove to be both a curse and a blessing, as we shall see. During his early period commanding troops in the Western Theater, Grant believed the Confederates could easily be persuaded against fighting. Despite his time living in the slave state of Missouri, for about 5 years in the 1850s, he did not yet understand how far the Southern people would go to protect slavery as well as their agrarian way of life. Even the hundreds of thousands who did not own enslaved people refused to allow the invading troops to take possession of their land and destroy what they felt was rightfully theirs without a fight. Grant's baptism of fire as a general comes in November 1861. His forces successfully raid the Confederate camp at Belmont, Missouri, who fell back across the Mississippi River to the Confederate stronghold at Columbus, Kentucky, which sat on a bluff protected by the artillery. In this next slide, if you look to the lower left, Grant's troops embarked at that port there and attacked as you follow those blue lines moving north and to the east. The Confederates are in the red, and Grant's small army pushed them back across the mighty Mississippi and over into Columbus. So Grant actually won that. But as his men were confiscating goods and celebrating their easy victory, the Confederates counterattacked and forced the Union troops back onto their steamboats and up the river. During the battle, Grant's horses shot out from under him in the fight, but he learns a valuable lesson. He wrote later that, quote, "The place where the Confederates had encamped was still there, but the troops were gone. It occurred to me at once that Colonel Harris, the Confederate commander, had been as much afraid of me as I had of him. This view of the question I had never taken before, but it was one I never forgot afterwards." He then moved east to take possession of the Kentucky and Cumberland rivers, which were both guarded by Confederate forts. Grant showed his ability to work with the Navy and then devise a plan first to capture Fort Henry and then Fort Donelson. He believed that if he took the initiative, the Confederate General Polk, uncertain of Grant's plan, would be slow to react in defending. In addition, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston had troops waiting in Bowling Green, Kentucky in early February of '62. So Grant thought it imperative to attack as soon as possible. He also knew that Fort Henry only had about 3,000 defenders at the time, and he figured if he acted quick enough, he could pound the fort into submission from Commodore Andrew Foote's gunboats. And on February 6th, Foote launched an attack from his gunboats that devastated the poorly defended fort, forcing the few Confederates there to retreat across the peninsula to the better defended Fort Donelson. Once the South lost Fort Henry, Confederate Generals Pillow and Floyd were more intent on strengthening their defenses at Donelson, 12 miles to the east, as opposed to slowing down the Union advance. And Grant's plan took that exact thought into perspective. He came to realize that by taking the initiative, even without full knowledge of the enemy's movements or strengths, gave him a strategic advantage. His offensive mindset would dictate where and when to fight and keep the enemy on the defensive. He also focused most of his efforts on his own army and strategy versus that of the enemy. This mentality would render him great victories, but also allow the enemy to occasionally catch him by surprise. After capturing Fort Henry, Grant moved his troops as quickly as possible across the peninsula to attack Fort Donelson. He knew that it was better equipped with heavy artillery and good interior lines. His initial plan was to use Foote's gunboats once again to pound the defenses, but this time the Confederates had longer range cannon that could fire on the gunboats as soon as they came into view. And this is a picture recently taken of Fort Donelson. And as you can see, even though this is a modern picture, you can see those 3 cannon, and there were many more than that, aimed straight up the river. So in the upper right, as soon as Foot's boats came around that corner, they were under heavy artillery attack. The Confederate artillery forced the gunboats to retreat with heavy damage. Grant then ordered an overland attack, which took longer than he had hoped because the rains had slowed down. They had turned the roads into a muddy quagmire. And his attack had initial success, but a strong counterattack came decisively close to breaking the Union right. In this slide here, if you look on the right side, you can see Pillow's troops here moving across the creek and out of their defenses and pushing the Union all the way back further south and to the west. But Lew Wallace's three subordinates, Smith, Thayer, and Cruft, stopped the attempt, as you can see on the lower right. Grant was meeting on a gunboat when the breakout attempt began, but galloped back to personally take charge and close the gap. Although his line bent, it never broke. The failed breakout essentially forced the Confederates back up against the river. And the following day, on February the 16th, the garrison at Fort Donelson surrendered. The double victory at Henry and Donelson was the largest and most strategically important campaign by any Union army in the war to that point. This also brought national attention to Grant, who becomes famous with his dispatch to the Confederate commander, "No terms except immediate and unconditional surrender. I propose to move immediately upon your works." And he quickly earns the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant had never dealt with an entire army surrendering, so he and his staff were completely unaware of the proper protocol. And he actually thought that he was dealing with Confederate General Pillow, whom he despised. Once he realized he was dealing with his old friend, General Bolivar Buckner from Kentucky, the entire mood changed. They began with small talk of the old days, and Grant actually stepped back from the initial demand. Many of the captured troops were let on parole. He was a quick study and greatly improved his abilities to negotiate with the enemy as a result of the experience at Donelson. The conquest of these two forts by Grant and Foote eventually severed the Confederacy in two by opening both the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers to Union control. As for Grant, he was appropriately awarded a second star and promoted to Major General. His command now included the western portions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and the state of Mississippi. William Feast, who's a Grant biographer, wrote a book about his Secret Service and correctly summarized Grant's approach, stating, quote, "During times when information eluded him, Grant refused to allow uncertainty to paralyze him. Instead, he filled the information vacuum with his own experiences, intuition, and his faith in the initiative." As a general, Grant wrote many of his own correspondence and orders, and each of his generals was given orders based on his confidence in them. He wanted to ensure that no one could misunderstand any of his orders. They were direct and short. His relations with the staff and his generals, however, were mixed. He favored those who, like himself, Sherman, Sheridan, and later Hancock and others, would fight. But he was not one to sit idle and allow the enemy to take the initiative. Unfortunately, he held that against several of his generals who were highly qualified, including General George Thomas. John Russell Young, a journalist who accompanied Grant on his 2-year trip around the world after he left the White House, summed up the uniqueness of the general. He said, quote, "Grant had rare gifts, shrouded in that mist of shyness, inseparable from his character. His memory was a marvel. He never forgot a name or a face, and this wonderful gift served him well as a soldier. Grant's next mission was to capture the railroad town of Corinth, Mississippi, just below the Tennessee line. As you can see, this was a critical junction that connected the southeast supply route from Charleston and the southern route from New Orleans. You can also see Shiloh, just northeast of Corinth, where Grant's troops would be stationed in early April. Grant knew that the Confederates under General Johnston were in the area of Corinth, but he was unsure of their exact location. Grant believed that the mental state of any rebel soldier was close to the breaking point. He figured they would simply desert in the fighting or surrender when pressed. True to his aggressive nature, he and Sherman planned an assault on Corinth. Pickets on reconnaissance duty were laid to the officers under Grant's subordinates, Generals Lew Wallace and Sherman, that the enemy was close and moving en masse towards Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. Why neither one of them took those warnings seriously is still being debated by historians today. Grant felt that he had an advantageous position on the high ground between two creeks, as well as the Tennessee River on his left flank. Union General Buell was also en route by steamboat with reinforcements, which would dock at Pittsburgh Landing, and that gave Grant no reason to create a defensive perimeter. He was fully prepared to go on the offensive as soon as Buell arrived, which was scheduled for midday on April the 6th. And here you can see the positions of the Union and Confederate Army prior to the attack. Grant's troops are stationed near Pittsburgh Landing with Lew Wallace at the top of the slide at Crump's Landing. The Confederates are in red at the lower left. Apparently, Grant later felt that Lew Wallace's force could be attacked, and he may have taken the morning's gunfire for confirmation of that suspicion. He warned both Sherman and W.H. Lew L. Wallace that an attack at Crump's Landing seemed quite likely, and that boats should be prepared to reinforce that spot at a moment's notice. Saturday night, he had Colonel McPherson, who had become one of his most trusted staff members, remain with W.H.L. Wallace at Pittsburgh Landing and act in reserve if needed. Saturday night, Grant notified Halleck and the Confederates in and around Corinth that they were present in great strength. He believed that Johnson had about 80,000 men with him, and he suspected that some of these were organized around the line of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which ran from Corinth up to the recently evacuated Confederate stronghold at Columbus, Kentucky. He was ideally situated if his suspicion was correct, and Johnson attacked the Union flank at Crump's Landing. But Sherman and Prentiss, who had the forward lines, sent out patrols very early Sunday morning to learn what might lie in front of them. McPherson wrote that, quote, "It is well known the enemy was approaching our lines." Clearly enough, Grant had believed some sort of fight must soon be thrust upon him. The one thing he did not anticipate was what actually occurred, and that was a massive attack on his front by Johnston's entire army. The spring morning of April the 6th, Johnson's troops struck the unprepared Union lines at dawn with the force of a hammer. Some of the fiercest fighting of the war took place at what later came to be known as the Hornet's Nest. And this is a recent artist's depiction of how awful it must have been in the Hornet's Nest, where they were actually close enough for hand-to-hand combat. Grant's army was forced to retreat en masse toward the Tennessee River. To save his command, he crisscrossed the Union line continuously throughout the battle, sometimes under fire to rally his troops wherever they gave ground. By the end of the day, the Confederates owned much of the field, but at a huge cost. General Johnston was killed by a sniper's bullet, and with him, the momentum that carried the Confederates that day. Grant's army had been pushed to the breaking point, but that night, General Buell arrived at Pittsburgh Landing with thousands of reinforcements. A newspaper correspondent saw Grant sitting on his horse in the midst of all of this, apparently unruffled. News of possible surrender had spread, and most of the men around the camp were gloomy. One of them found the nerve to ask Grant if he did not think the situation extremely dark. "Oh no," he said, "they can't break our lines tonight. It's too late. Tomorrow we shall attack them with fresh troops and drive them, of course." The correspondent describing the incident said afterward, quote, "From that moment on, I never doubted Grant would be recognized not only as a great soldier, but a great man." He and Sherman met later that night to plan the attack on April 7th. Sherman remarked famously, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day of it, haven't we?" Grant replied to his trusted friend, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And lick 'em they did. After heavy fighting, Grant's men drove the Confederates in a rout back toward Corinth. By the night of April 7th, the bloodiest battle of the war up to that point had ended. And this was really the first battle that essentially defined the commitment that both sides brought to the battlefield. The result was carnage beyond anyone's previous experience in American history. Fully 23,000 men on both sides were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The leaders on both sides now fully understood that the war would not end quickly or easily. Thousands of wounded were transported north to makeshift hospitals along the rivers in Paducah, Newport, Kentucky, and a new one that was built just east of Cincinnati on the grounds of Camp Dennison to care for the wounded for the rest of the war. Grant learned several important lessons after Shiloh. He finally understood that the only way to victory was the complete destruction of the enemy's army, as well as demoralizing its people. He defined this new concept, stating, quote, "Only complete conquest would end this war." In other words, bring the war literally to the doorsteps of the civilians. He also learned to consume everything that could be used to support or supply the Union armies, better known as contraband. And that would eventually include the escaped enslaved people. But he learned that winning was not enough, at least at this point in his career. There were ongoing reports of Grant drinking and getting surprised by the Confederates during both Donelson and Shiloh campaigns. They came from jealous generals and anti-war newspapers. After Shiloh, a spy had taken over one of the telegraph stations and intercepted several of Grant's correspondence to his boss at the time, General Henry Halleck, or Old Brains as he was known at the time. Halleck figured without cause that Grant had been drinking and took over command in the field, thus relegating him to a subordinate role. Grant replied that he had telegraphed daily and that it was not his fault. But Halleck persisted and communicated his decision to leaders in Washington. And at that point, Grant actually considered resigning. Finally, his old friend Washburn telegraphed the president about Halleck's threats. Lincoln had one of the generals telegraph Halleck asking several questions aimed at proving Grant's insubordination. After consideration and that letter, Halleck reinstated Grant to his proper command, and in July, Halleck was reassigned to Washington. In the summer of 1862, Grant would begin using a group of spies under the direction of a gentleman named Grenville Dodge. Dodge was already a seasoned intelligence officer, and he built a spy network that would prove valuable to Grant as he began his plans to march against Vicksburg. The well-defended city on the hill was known as the Gibraltar of the West, due to its proximity above a horseshoe bend on the Mississippi River. It was extremely well fortified with artillery, surrounded by a series of trenches north and east of the town, a swamp to the south, and the Mississippi River directly to the west. On November 12th of 62, Dodge uncovered news that General Braxton Bragg had dispatched troops to Mississippi from Kentucky, and he relayed the message to Grant, and it confirmed his intuition that Bragg planned to either support Vicksburg or harass Grant's rear guard. Although the rumor proved false, it made Grant rethink his strategy. Grant asked Dodge to detect any troop movement that may be headed west at all points along the Tennessee River as far east as Alabama. From that order, Dodge created a spy network that would assist Grant throughout his Western campaigns. Dodge began recruiting Unionists in the South to monitor Confederate movement deep in enemy territory. He also began sending Union troops stationed in or near Confederate lines to gather information. His corps of scouts and spies would eventually number 130 by 1863. Most were volunteers that would assist in locations that were familiar with the areas they were from. And he set up permanent spies in Atlanta, Chattanooga, Mobile, Vicksburg, and other southern cities. Grant funded Dodge's organization, interestingly enough, by using fees collected from legal contracts that allowed cotton to be transported through his lines, as well as cotton and other property he confiscated from the secessionists. Grant told Dodge at one point that his command was much more important than that of even a division commander in the field. And he used Dodge during the Vicksburg campaign in several salient roles. After Shiloh, he counted on his division commanders to use recon measures so they could be sure of what was in their front. However, due in part to the lack of accurate reconnaissance, Grant's original plan of attacking Vicksburg from the north by land failed. The new year, 1863, brought a new strategy. First, Grant would live off the land as his hero, Winfield Scott, did during the Mexican War. As a former quartermaster, Grant learned the importance of living off the land when supply lines were cut. In fact, he approved Sherman's march using that same approach a year later. Second, he partnered with Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, who commanded a fleet of ironclads. And this is a picture of Porter posing on one of his ironclad ships. Together, they planned to break through the well-guarded gauntlet around the hairpin turn in the river, which passed directly in front of the city. This proved extremely dangerous because the steamers would have to slow to a crawl in order to navigate the tight bend, and it would place them in direct line of the massive artillery protecting the city. But if the Navy could successfully run that gauntlet, Grant could reinforce his men south of Vicksburg. The plan would prove both challenging and lengthy. A third goal was to keep the Confederates guessing about Grant's intentions. He accomplished this by continually moving his army against multiple targets, as well as feints, which kept the enemy off guard. And this is a slide of the Vicksburg campaign. The Union forces on your upper left, under vanguard lead Milliken's Bend, and essentially follow several waterways down and attempt to cross at hard times, but a rebel force at Grand Gulf halts that attempt. So they moved south again and finally cross at Bruinsburg on April 30th. The following day, they take Fort Gibson and begin moving north. At this point, soon after, Grant splits his army and sends General Sherman to take Jackson, the capital, because he knows there is another Confederate army in the area. Once he secures Jackson, as you can see, he moves directly west and quickly wins battles at Champions Hill on May 16th, Big Black Bridge on May 17th, before moving on to Vicksburg. His comprehensive plan eventually yielded the results he expected, but heavy losses incurred from two major frontal assaults in May essentially forced him into a siege. And this next slide is an actual depiction after the siege. If you can imagine this, the residents had to dig these caves into the hillside to survive the artillery bombardment that lasted much of June. And they would eat, by the end, anything literally that was alive on four legs. So Grant essentially starved them out. This is considered by several Grant historians to be his greatest victory. It demonstrated his ability to learn from his mistakes, utilize an intelligence network of spies, and couple that with his innate confidence in his plan and his army. I want to touch on the drunken theme for just a moment. I believe it's a complete fabrication. Grant did have a self-proclaimed drinking problem because he could not hold his liquor. A few drinks would send him over the top, but there is no proof that he was drunk during any battle of the Civil War. And one of the controversies that arose from Vicksburg was a rumor that he had been drunk after a party on a ship during the campaign. General Rawlins, who was Grant's chief of staff and his self-proclaimed protector, heard the rumor from a reporter named Sylvanus Cadwallader. Now, Cadwallader was a war correspondent for both the Chicago Times and later the New York Herald. He was also attached to Grant's headquarters from 62 to 65, and he actually liked and respected Grant, and vice versa. The rumor from the Vicksburg siege became legend and has been sustained throughout history and is an example of Grant being a drunk. But after researching the incident, there is no primary evidence from anyone who was actually on the ship or at the meeting that Grant was drunk. This is the case of many of the rumors that followed Grant on his rise as a general and his campaigns for the presidency and throughout history. We hear so much today about fake news and the challenge of sifting through all the noise to figure out the truth. Well, the same was true during the Civil War. One of the best examples I found that refutes the rumor came from Mary Livermore, who was with the Sanitary Commission, a predecessor of the Red Cross. And here's a depiction, actual photograph of an older Mary Livermore. In her autobiography, she defined her first meeting with Grant. She explained that in their journey as they came down the river, her staff experienced many officers who were using alcohol in what she called extreme fashion. But she said that, quote, in the first 5 minutes of our interview, we learned by some sort of spiritual telegraphy that reticence, patience, and persistence was the dominant traits of General Grant. Neither was the general a drunkard. That was immediately apparent to us. She continued, the clear eye, clean skin, firm flesh, and steady nerves of General Grant gave the lie to the universal rumor concerning his intemperate habits and those of his officers and staff. A park ranger at the Grant site in Whitehaven, St. Louis, and a recent historian have also refuted those rumors with facts, and that's good enough for me. After his victory at Vicksburg, Grant was promoted once again and given command of the entire Western Theater. So from this point forward, the Confederacy was entirely on the defensive and forced to protect their holdings and prolong the war, hoping that Lincoln would lose his reelection in 1864. In September of '63, Grant received news that General William Rosecrans' troops were trapped at Chattanooga, and he had no plan to relieve them whatsoever. Grant soon left for the besieged city to view the situation for himself. What he witnessed was an army bordering on starvation. But in typical fashion, he quickly figured a way to transport the supplies over a horseshoe bend across from the city, then by boat through a lightly protected landing across the Tennessee River from the city. Once he saved the embattled force, his next goal was formulating a plan to defeat General Bragg, who had the army there. The Confederate general held the high ground at both Lookout Mountain, which overlooks Tennessee from 1,800 feet above the valley to the south, and Missionary Ridge, which towered 400 feet above the city from the east. Bragg clearly held the face cards in this match. And here's a depiction of the Chattanooga campaign. And what we have here, Grant had three generals under him at this point: Sherman, Thomas, and Hooker. Hooker had the southern area and was commanded to first take Lookout Mountain, which he attempted to do. But for those of you who ever been to Chattanooga, that's a sheer wall. So he had to go around the north end of that, come back around. And by the time he got there, the quote, battle above the clouds was really not much more than a skirmish. There weren't many Confederates left up there, and they basically had retreated, and he ran the rest off behind the lines on Missionary Ridge. He did, however, help by keeping Bragg's army focused on the left flank where Hooker was. Then we have Thomas in the middle, whose orders were to charge Missionary Ridge and take the trenches at the foot of the ridge and stop. Essentially, Grant hoped to pull all of Bragg's forces into the middle and open the way for his favorite general, who was to attack Bragg's right. That was Sherman. Unfortunately, Sherman didn't personally do reconnaissance on the hill at the north base of Missionary Ridge. And the hill he thought was actually the base was not. It was a hill further north. And Sherman's men come over that hill thinking that they have an easy time, reach the base, and they come under heavy fire from the Confederates up on that hill. So he really doesn't have much of a say in this, again, except to keep Bragg's troops spread out. So Grant's initial plan did not go as planned. But what's interesting is Thomas's men did not stop at the base of that hill, and Bragg never figured that any force could make a successful frontal assault against Missionary Ridge. And unfortunately for him, General Thomas' men did take the initiative and literally went up that hill, but they decided without orders to ascend the heights and go over the top on their own. And this is a later view of the steepness of that hill that they came up. They had only two advantages. The first was that the artillery could not fire at that low an angle. And the second was there was all kind of brush and entanglements coming up there, so it was even hard to see them. Obviously, that was hard to climb as well, but there were several openings and ruts in that hillside that they could come up. And they ended up moving over the top again, storming the ridge, and after fierce fighting, they took the entire ridge and captured hundreds of Confederates and forced Bragg's army into full retreat. Once again, a combination of skill, luck, and determination presented Grant with his final victory in the West. And by the end of 1863, Grant had won every single campaign where he was put in charge. In March of 1864, Grant is promoted to Lieutenant General and named General-in-Chief of all Union armies, East and West. He never asked for the promotion and told Lincoln at their very first meeting that if they lost, it would be no fault of Lincoln's or Washington. This was a complete opposite of what the commanders prior to him with the Army of the Potomac would say. Grant did not boast that he would defeat Lee. He simply went about planning his offensive quietly as he had done in the past. As a Westerner, despite his record, he did not have the trust of the Army of the Potomac. Grant appeared to those soldiers as anything but a commanding general. The overall feeling of the troops was they did not believe that he could defeat Lee, and he would have to prove it on the battlefield. After 3 years of war, he learned a great deal about commanding troops and the importance of spies, and he understood the total commitment it would take to win, especially against General Lee. In his estimation, it would include a combined effort from every theater simultaneously, defeating the armies in the field, as opposed to just capturing cities and forts. In a meeting with Secretary of War Stanton and Lincoln, they felt more pressure had to be placed on Lee and capturing Richmond, as well as defending Washington. So Lee meets with his close friend, Tecumseh Sherman, at the famous Burnett House on March 20th, 1864, to finalize plans for what becomes known as the Overland Campaign. The Burnett House was the greatest, most well-known, nicest hotel west of the mountains. Many dignitaries and presidents stayed here during their visits to Cincinnati, as well as when they passed through. Together, Sherman and Grant devised a coordinated strategy that would strike at the heart of the Confederacy in every single theater, and finally end the slaughter. Grant's plan had several components. First, it placed the victor of Gettysburg, General George Gordon Meade, and Benjamin Butler directly against Lee near Richmond. Second, he ordered General Francis Sigel to capture the Shenandoah Valley, sent his friend Sherman to invade Georgia to defeat Joseph E. Johnston and capture Atlanta. And third, he named General Crook and William Averill to operate against railroad supply lines in West Virginia. And finally, he hoped that General Nathaniel Banks could eventually capture Mobile, Alabama. The key to this was the first time that the Union Army would have a coordinated offensive strategy across several theaters. That's how well Grant came to understand his adversaries and the art of war itself. And he personally, his campaigns here rewrite military history books with this approach. He also utilized the Bureau of Military Intelligence, or BMI, which was the beginning of what would later form the basis of the Secret Service. The BMI was a spy network that gathered information from a variety of sources, including interrogating captured soldiers, use of cavalry, intercepting visual signals, and captured correspondence. They read many of the Southern newspapers to gain an understanding of the military, political, and economic conditions throughout the South, but especially in the regions Grant planned to attack. The BMI combined the reports and data that analyzed and summarized the information by hand. they would prove extremely valuable, although not 100% accurate, to help Grant in the overland campaign. In this next slide is a depiction of the overland campaign. It begins May of 1864. And the important thing here is after the Battle of Wilderness, the Army of the Potomac are fully expecting Grant to turn left and retreat back up to the north after the battle. Instead, of course, he turns right, and immediately the troops line up and not only credit him, but cheer him as he goes by, because they know for the first time they finally have a general who will fight. And fight, as most of you know, they did. Moving to Spotsylvania Courthouse, then to North Anna, then to Cold Harbor. And in that amount of short time, the losses continued to mount. Grant is more astute than given credit for, summarizing the reason behind his plans years later. He knew that Lee had been fighting the Army of the Potomac for 3 years, and although he was victorious in most battles, neither side made any real progress toward ending the war. So Grant called it essentially a military stalemate, but he understood the incredible cost in blood. And in the end, he believed that taking the fight to Lee would, quote, impress the Virginians with the knowledge that the Yankees can and will fight. This would do more good, he said, than to capture even Richmond. Just before the start of it, Grant wrote Sherman what he expected from Lee. My own opinion, he wrote, is that Lee is averse to going out of Virginia. And if the cause of the South is lost, he wants Richmond to be the last place surrendered. If he has such views, it may be well to indulge him until everything else is in our hands. By the end of April, Grant has concentrated almost 120,000 men along the Rapidan River to confront Lee's 65,000. And his reputation as a butcher really comes to fruition after these first 6 weeks. The bloodbath was unlike anything in American history. Grant essentially came east with the same offensive strategy he used in the West. But of course, Lee was not Pemberton or Bragg or anybody else that he had fought before. And Grant telegraphed Washington after the Wilderness Battle to clarify his intentions to both Lincoln and Stanton. In it, he wrote, I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. The message was clear that he was not retreating. However, his detractors, the Southern generals and academia after the war, began using that quote against him as a result of the losses that he had incurred in that campaign and given. The reality is that after the failed assault on Cold Harbor, Grant decided for the most part against frontal assaults en masse. After that battle, he broke off again, crossed the James River unbeknownst to Lee, and moved against Petersburg below Richmond. It was another daring maneuver similar to him crossing the Mississippi below Vicksburg. Unfortunately, it didn't go as planned, and Lee finally caught up. But he continued to force Lee to fight without any pause or delay, and simultaneously began to attack the weak spots in the Confederate lines, forcing Lee to keep his front heavily defended. And this is a slide of the Petersburg campaign. And the whole goal here, while you can see the blue lines of the Union keeping the red lines of the Confederates in place, if you look outside to the east, south, and west of the Union lines, you will see one by one that he began cutting Lee's supply lines. The railroad lines to Charleston, then to Atlanta, And although it took months, he finally severed the last line. Grant's strategy eventually wore Lee's army down and finally cut it off. And because of his grand strategy, Lee could not expect reinforcements from other theaters as he had done in the past. The first few months of the Overland Campaign became the bloodiest period of the war. Between both sides, the losses were a staggering 80,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Grant's losses amounted to 47%, which seems high until you look at Lee's, which was over 50%. And more important from that standpoint was he had no replacements. So his army continued to disintegrate throughout the campaign. Despite his role and schedule, Grant developed a deep friendship with Abraham Lincoln throughout the war. They met for the first time in 1864 when Lincoln and Congress promoted him to lieutenant general. He and Lincoln had much in common as Westerners, and their respect for each other was reciprocal. Although a novice on anything military related in 1861, Lincoln was a fast learner as well and learned a great deal about the art of war during his many hours spent in the war room. He figured early on that the best way to end the war was through attrition. That was one of the major qualities that he found in Grant. And Lincoln visited Grant at his headquarters at City Point, Virginia, several times during the last few months of the war to escape the pressure of Washington and also discuss strategy and just learn and get to know more about Grant. "I know Lincoln well," Grant said, "no one better. And I am very grateful that he spent almost his last days in my camp. He was the greatest man I have ever known, either from personal observation or historical study. This is a man who met dignitaries, kings, etc. around the world on his tour after his presidency." The president finally found a general he knew would fight, and fight he did. And finally, he defeats Lee at Appomattox in April, as I said earlier, at 65. So the son of a tanner from Ohio and a failure in several business ventures finally reaches the pinnacle. His reputation by the time he died in 1885 was set alongside with Lincoln as the two greatest Americans of the 19th century. But Grant's star soon began to fade after he died. The Southern writers created the myth of the lost cause and began defining Grant as a butcher and a drunk while elevating Lee to almost deity status. Writers and historians for almost 100 years perpetrated that myth, but a few famous Americans realized the real Grant during their time. And that support came from several future presidents who fought in war, and I will quote just two. The first is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy was asked to honor Grant with a speech at Galena, Illinois in 1900. He was a huge fan, not only of Grant's effort as a general, but also in peace. And one of Grant's critical acts as president that also impressed Roosevelt that most people don't know anything about was he saved what is now Yellowstone National Park. That's the first time in American history that a president laid land aside so that it could not be developed. Roosevelt said in part, quote, "As the generations slip away and the dust of conflict settles, and as through the clearing air, we look back with keener wisdom into the nation's past, mightiest among the mighty dead loom the three great figures of Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. These three greatest men have taken their place among the greatest men of all nations, the greatest men of all time. Grant's supreme virtue as a soldier was his doggedness. Unsparing in battle, he was very merciful in victory. The man who more than any other, save Lincoln, had changed us into a nation whose citizens were all free men. Every man who does his duty as a soldier, a statesman, or a private citizen is paying to Grant the memory, this kind of homage that is best worth paying. Gene Edward Smith, a recent Grant biographer who helped redefine the true Grant as well, compared him to Dwight David Eisenhower. Gene Smith described both as successful warriors that became adamant about keeping the nation at peace once they occupied the presidential chair. And in 1850, President Eisenhower, also a West Point graduate, paid Grant this tribute. He said, quote, "The fact is, he never demanded more men or material from the War Department. He took over an army that had a long history of retreating and losing. That army had no confidence in their fighting ability, and Grant came in as a real outsider. He also had many disadvantages going into the 1864 campaign, but he met every test, rose to the occasion unlike any I've ever seen in American history. This is the man who was the Allied commander at D-Day in World War II. He finished stating, "It never seemed possible for me that a man who's so constantly under the influence of liquor have maintained the respect of such men as Sherman, Sheridan, Meade, and above all, President Lincoln." Grant is very undervalued today, which is a shame because he was one of the greatest generals, if not the greatest. And finally, Grant was given his proper place in 2019 when his statue was placed on the plains at West Point, along with Lee, Patton, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and other great graduates. For those of you who have not been on West Point, the plains is the focal point of where all of the former famous West Point graduates' statues are. So it's an incredible honor, long overdue, to pay tribute to the man that so many people in high places had great respect for and admired. Thank you for celebrating the true legacy of Ulysses S. Grant.